My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is attorney, former law school dean, and current Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson. In 2022, Secretary Benson was recognized for her refusal to back down in the face of threats and harassment in the wake of the 2020 presidential election with the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. She's running for governor of Michigan in 2026, and she's the author of the recently released book, The Purposeful Warrior, Standing Up for What's Right When the Stakes Are High, which we'll be talking about today. Jocelyn Benson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I like to start with book titles, and I think yours is a great one, The Purposeful Warrior. So my obvious question is, what's a purposeful warrior? And honestly, in this age of hyper-partisan, do we need more warriors in politics?
Well, it's a great question. What I think is we need more people with moral courage. We're in a moment where political leaders with moral courage are of short supply. And I think it's really important that leaders be honest, stand up for and live by our shared values, and are people who are willing to be courageous and do the right thing always, and not try to hide or run from who we are because it's perhaps politically expedient or easier to do so. Being a purposeful warrior is about knowing your why and fighting for it, whether it's fighting for access to healthcare because you saw how limited access to healthcare or expensive medicine impacted your parents, yourself, or your loved ones. It's about making sure that if you're in a workplace that is toxic, that you are fighting for both a better workplace and perhaps a better environment overall. It's about, seeing climate change or seeing dirty water in your pipes and fighting with purpose to make sure that you get clean water and access to clean air. Above all, it's making sure that we have a fire within us and we recognize, even in times of turbulence or uncertainty or chaos or confusion, that we can double down within that light inside us, that fire, that certainty that comes from it, and fight for our sincere purpose with integrity, with focus. And the book is really about how to do that.
And I think that's something that almost everyone agrees with in principle. But then when the stakes are high, that can be pretty difficult because, most people tend to be kind of risk averse. And if you go out on a limb and you buck whatever, you stand a good chance of sort of being there on your own. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, aside from telling people be more courageous, which sometimes isn't very helpful, do you think there's anything in terms of like the incentives in politics that we can work on or change that might make it easier for people to display this sort of courage?
Yeah, I think it starts by being very clear who you are and who you want to be. So for me, and I talk about this in the first chapter, my heroes are those who stood at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama in 1965 and marched forward anyway, even in towards a certain violence, because they believed in their why. They believed in the one person, one vote promise in our Constitution as being something we all as Americans needed to fight for and defend. And yes, whether it's then or now, the political arena can often reward caution over courage. especially when we have systems in place where elected officials who take bold, principled stances that sometimes mean ruffling the feathers of powerful interests can face retribution. One of the things I talk about in the second chapter with when I stood up to President Trump is that, bullies tend to punch back. And so you have to be prepared for that. But we can find strength in community. We can find strength in connecting with those who come before us and have achieved great things because they've been courageous. And we can connect with the folks who need us to be courageous so that they can have a better life. And I think when you look and fill your mind with those stories of those who've come before us, those who are among us and fighting similar fights, and those who need us to fight those fights, that gives us the strength to overcome the folks in power or bullies in the workplace who may be trying to use their power to stand in our way.
I sometimes wonder if both parties, but particularly the Democrats, have become to a certain extent captured by the professional consultant class, which to me would be, to me, it seems like that's a whole group where their incentive is to not encourage you to take big swings, to do big radical things, because chances are they might not work. And so you're safer kind of doing that. And so especially if you're not necessarily super experienced or someone with your own brand, like say a Donald Trump or an AOC, that might be a lot tougher to do, no?
Oh, yeah. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we don't do it, right?
Yeah.
It's always a question about, like, do we choose fear or courage? Do we choose the easy path or the hard path? And for me, the inspirational figures in my life and the people throughout history who have actually accomplished something, actually done something, actually delivered, they are folks who will take the hard path unafraid, knowing that sometimes whether what's hard or easy doesn't indicate what's right or wrong. And instead, we can, find through our own ways to mitigate risk, but also and be smart and strategic, but at the same time be effective. And that's what I've tried to be through my whole career. It does mean being willing to, sometimes have some mud thrown at you, right? And even anger the people in our own party. But my North Star is, am I delivering? Am I actually getting things done? Because otherwise, why are we doing this, right? What are we here for if not to move the needle on the issues we care about? So for me, it's always worth it when you can have an impact. And I talk about being mission driven. There's a whole chapter in my book about being mission driven and that mission being improving people's lives. If we stay focused on that and surround ourselves with others who help us stay focused on that, that enables us to take on anyone who would try to, whether it's consultants or whether it's, President of the United States, who would try to take us away from that goal and instead just stay purposeful and be a warrior for that purpose.
You just mentioned angering people in your own party. I'm glad you did, because if we look back, there were 17 congressional Republicans who voted either to impeach or to convict Donald Trump. Now, today, only 5 of them are still in Congress. This is the body where the overall reelection rate is right around 90%. And so now you have an administration which pretty clearly is happy to go in and seek vengeance and settle scores. You've got the world's richest person who's happy to fund primary challenges. So if I'm a congressional Republican, I have a real environment of fear here. And so I'm wondering, what would you say to congressional Republicans who would disagree with a lot or some of what President Trump is doing? And I know they're out there, but they understandably fear what could happen to them, not just their political careers, but in some instances, you can make a good case that there's a personal safety issue here as well.
Yeah, I think it starts by saying, are you going to choose to be fearful or are you going to choose to be courageous? And I believe that voters who send these folks to Washington to fight on their behalf do not send them to Washington to be fearful and afraid of what speaking out might cost them. They send them to Washington to do the right thing on their behalf. And that's really what service and public service is all about. And being a leader requires you, and history is full with these examples, requires you to choose that courageous route, even if it can potentially cause danger. Now, no one, and there is no place for danger in our political arena, and we have to continue to stand up to it. But certainly, as myself, who's had armed protesters outside my home, Josh Shapiro, who saw tragedy come to his home over the last few weeks, certainly there are ramifications for simply doing the right thing. That doesn't mean that we don't do the right thing. It means that we protect ourselves and have security, but we're willing to stand up on that ledge because that's what public service actually requires of us. And to those who have left and like an Adam Kinzinger, who I consider a friend, or a Liz Cheney, history will show that they not only were on the right side of history, but they have found other ways to inspire other people to live their values and fight for change. We are certainly at a challenging era for federal government leadership. The only thing, though, that will change that is if the folks in federal government actually listen to the people who sent them to Washington, not to those who, using fear as a weapon to further their own agenda that perhaps runs contrary to the needs of their constituents.
Now you've been involved in politics in Michigan for a while now. And so what we've seen in Michigan is what used to be a pretty reliably Democratic state in the 90s and even into the 2000s become sort of a real toss-up state in the age of Trump. And I wanted to get, as somebody who's seen this, on the ground, what do you think has happened here in your state?
Yeah, Michigan has always been a microcosm of the country. We have a diverse population, rural, urban, manufacturing base, lots of different business leaders, a strong labor base. There's a lot of different voices in this state. It's what makes it truly a purple state and always has been. And I think it also makes it a state that where all of us nationally can also learn a lot of lessons by seeing what successful leaders do in Michigan, particularly successful Democrats like Governor Whitmer, like Alyssa Slotkin, and many others who, like as I've done throughout the last several years of my leadership, travel around the state and listen and then take action and actually deliver. Making sure if folks are saying we need you to address the housing crisis, that we do that we don't just talk, that we actually follow up with action. When I took over as Secretary of State, went around the state and talked to folks, and it was very clear, our branch offices, I run the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, and it was highly inefficient, lots of wasteful spending, lots of red tape. And so I went to work and actually fixed that. We eliminated wait times in our branch office and made our agency a poster child for government efficiency and making people's lives easier, putting kiosks in grocery stores for you to renew your driver's license, for example. So I believe that if we, as Democrats or as leaders, go around the state, listen to folks, and develop policies and solutions that will ensure government works for everyone, that we can cut through red tape, promote efficiency, that's what people will respond to and support. Because at the end of the day, they're really just looking for us as leaders to make their lives a little easier, cut costs, improve wage access. And those who do that, regardless of the letter after their name, will find electoral success in our state.
You mentioned that you're in charge of the DMV, and I think a lot of people might actually realize all of the things that a Secretary of State does. And of course, now you've been Secretary of State since, I believe, 2019, so you've been in the job for years now. I'm hoping you could tell folks exactly what the main duties of a Secretary of State are.
The main things in most states is we oversee business filings and elections. In Michigan, it's a little bit unique because we oversee elections. I'm the chief election officer for the state, but I'm also the chief motor vehicle officer for the state. I'm one of only 2 secretaries of state that has that responsibility. But in that, it created an enormous opportunity because our agency interacts with everyone, no matter who they vote for or where they live. It gets an ID, a driver's license, changes their car title, gets their boating license or boating title through our office. And so it creates this great opportunity to show people through their personal experience, government can make your life a little easier. It doesn't have to be a nightmare to go and interact with a government agency. It can be efficient and smooth. And that's what we've done in contrast to other agencies in our state that haven't been as efficient as ours. We've been able to demonstrate to everyone that we touch that it's worth participating in government. It's worth voting because voting can lead to leaders who will make your lives easier, as I've tried to demonstrate through running the DMV.
Now, when you talk about government efficiency and the example in the book of the DMV, that's a very different approach to efficiency than, say, Doge is taking. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I didn't need a chainsaw to improve efficiency. I didn't need to fire everybody or fire people indiscriminately. We just took best practices and used data. And I tell the story in our book about setting up this. If it's not broke, fix it anyway. No one was clamoring to get me even to fix this broken motor vehicle system, but yet it was in desperate need of improvement, and it was unacceptable that people had to wait in line 7 hours and to get their basic services met by the government. So I get the importance, the critical importance. Sort of one of our most important jobs as government leaders is to keep people safe and make sure the trains run on time, right? And so we want to make sure through everything that we're doing that we're accomplishing those goals and demonstrating that, you don't need reckless sort of photo ops or any other type of actions that, so far don't seem to actually be producing any real efficiencies or change, just kind of making things worse. I think government needs to show up in places where it can make people's lives easier in an efficient way. And there's plenty of data and best practices on how to do that. And that's what we've been able to demonstrate in Michigan, quite in contrast to the chaos that is unfolding at the federal level.
And one of the titles of one of the chapters in your book is "If It Ain't Broke, Fix It Anyway." And when I read that title, when I read that chapter, I heard conservatives sort of in my head. I mean, like real conservatives, not right-wing populists, saying, "My God, we have so many actually broken things in this country that the last thing we need are your unelected, progressive, left-wing government bureaucrats and politicians butting in and fixing stuff that's not broken in the first place." And I'm sure you expect that response from the right. How do you respond to that?
Well, the point is I learned this adage from Paul Tagliabue, the long-serving commissioner of the National Football League. He consistently would tell me that as a way to looking at things in a way that may seem to be working just fine, but actually when you look under the hood, there's a whole lot of things we can do better. For example, when I started my job, we were keeping our driver's records on microfilm. Like, it was working fine, but we could make some improvements there. And we did, that had an effect of making things even better. And so the idea is, and there's lots of different ways. This is a philosophy in the business world. There's lots of different ways to approach it. But the essence of innovation is being able to see what can be and try to build it, even if what we're replacing or modernizing doesn't initially seem broken. And yes, we certainly have lots of broken things we need to fix. But in addition to that, if we really want to be bold and build out an innovative future, it requires us looking writ large of everything that we may be taking for granted or saying, oh, we're doing that just because it's the way it's always done. And saying, well, can we do it a little bit better? And some of the best business leaders in the world take that approach as well. And that's how we've seen such great innovative products over time.
And one would expect that if you have an approach like that, you actually catch things before they become hugely expensive and difficult problems. So you're actually saving money.
Indeed. I think so. We certainly have demonstrated that with our decisions at the branch offices. We've saved money. We've made people's lives easier. No one was clamoring for us to do it, but we saw what in some ways it's also seeing something that's going to be broken, but perhaps people, as you say, haven't noticed it yet, and then fixing it ahead of time. That's what, to me, competent, efficient management is all about.
In 2020, Donald Trump called you a rogue Secretary of State. Got to be a badge of honor. But I hope you could talk about how that came about and what you did to so upset Donald Trump and so many MAGA folks.
Oh, if only we knew all the times the things that we do to upset the president of the United States.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes it's hard to predict when just doing our jobs is going to lead to his ire, which was essentially what was happening here. I was doing my job. I'm the chief election officer. It was in the midst of a pandemic, and everyone was in Michigan, where you have a right to vote from home, to get your ballot through the mail and then return it at a drop box or through the mail. People have a right to do that in our state. And so in the midst of the pandemic, we knew more people were going to be wanting to stay home and perhaps vote from home. So I sent out information for everyone in the state, every voter, on how to do that with an application form so that you could request your ballot to be mailed to you if you so chose. And he, I guess, misinterpreted that or lied and said I sent ballots out to everybody and started attacking me for sending out ballots. And I had to respond on Twitter, which was very odd to like converse with the president of the United States on social media, but did so by saying, that's not what I did. And here's what I did. And it was particularly alarming because he threatened to withdraw federal funding from our state. This was back in 2020 in the midst of COVID. Because I had, because he believed I had sent out these ballots. And so, it was an ongoing battle, but it was really a lesson for me of when you're on the right side of things, and I was doing the right thing. Republican colleagues in other states were doing the same. You have to be willing to, be called all sorts of names and even take on powerful people in service of the job you were elected to do and the work the people of Michigan, in this case, needed me to do. So it was quite alarming, quite discerning, but a lesson in how to stand up to people who would use their, for lack of better words, bully pulpit to try to bully you away from doing the right thing for your people.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Ladies, you'll end up shopping for your guy's deodorant, right? So try Degree's Original Cool Rush. You see, last year, Degree changed the formula, and men were mad. One guy even started a petition. So Degree admitted they messed up and brought the Original Cool Rush scent back. It's clean, crisp, and actually smells like someone you want to cuddle. And it's in Walmart, Target, and other stores now for under $4. So toss one in your cart and find out why it's the best-selling men's antiperspirant for the last decade. Degree Cool Rush is back, and it smells like victory.
And while you've been Secretary of State since 2019, you've been very involved in politics since well before then. And so I'm sure you've seen the environment for election administrators in particular change in that period. And I was hoping you could talk about what those changes are and what concerns you the most about those changes.
Yeah, our election officials are professional, bipartisan leaders who are committed to just making sure our elections are secure, that everyone has access to their vote and things are run well. And typically that was an under the radar profession role to play. Sometimes on the local level, people would get upset that they won an election, but we could all agree to respect the will of the people. And what's really emerged, particularly after 2020, is this, is a departure from that, creating a more hyper-partisan, threat-laden environment for for these professional election officials, that just for doing their job, if someone doesn't like the outcome of an election, even the president of the United States, they'll start attacking you personally for doing your job and following the law. And it's never lost on me that those attacks are ultimately, oftentimes, they're attacking the idea that the rule of the people should rule the day. But the personification of election results that folks disagree with or the like are these, professionals who are simply just trying to keep their heads down and do their job. So it's become very tenuous. It's become very difficult and very challenging. But out of that has emerged a new cadre of professional election administrators on both sides of the aisle who are fully committed, even more so than before, to making sure elections are run well and secure and accessible to all, and protecting the process from this hyper-partisan political era we find ourselves in. So we're, I feel, using this challenging moment as an opportunity to get stronger and make our democracy stronger. But it certainly has become a more tense, tenuous environment for many. And of course, many have left the field as a result since 2016.
And 2020 in particular was a bizarre year for many reasons, but of course the big thing being the pandemic and all sorts of election changes that were made very quickly, certainly from a historical perspective, very quickly to try to deal with that. And when you look back at those changes that were made, do you feel like there's a case to be made that states either made too many changes too quickly or didn't do a good enough job of communicating those changes, and so in the process kind of shaking up public trust in the integrity of our election system?
Yeah, it's so interesting because certainly it seemed like a lot of things were changing in the COVID era, right? But in Michigan, actually, the changes the new aspects to voting in Michigan were actually enacted before 2020. It started with ballot amendments to our state constitution that voters enacted in 2018. And so interestingly, in Michigan, what happened in 2020 was not people changing election laws, in response to COVID. My focus was actually trying to keep everything the way everyone had always, keep that certainty in place. The election was going to happen. It was going to be on the same day. What was also happening was an overlay of these new changes that voters had made in 2018 that really essentially opened up voting. We created more options to voting, including voting from home. And so there was a lot of misunderstanding or perhaps even misinformation about what was new. And it was happening at a time where public trust and misinformation was percolating throughout our environment, from healthcare to schools and education to businesses. And so it was this moment of great uncertainty that I believe some people used to create distrust of the election process. But those of us in Michigan and really around the country, we're actually just trying to keep our heads down and make sure everyone could vote and following the law and following the procedures that were in place under the law long before COVID came into place. And that, of course, all then was exacerbated after the 2020 election when people didn't like the outcome of the vote, and the president certainly didn't like the outcome of the election, and then used all of the uncertainty of the moment to damage voters' trust in the process. And that's been something we've tried to build out of since then and restore that rightly placed faith people should have in our election systems.
I feel like a lot of folks on the right especially would say, listen, if you want to restore voters' trust in elections, it's not that difficult to do. People should only be able to vote in person on election day or maybe a few days before that. None of this, everyone gets to vote from home. No one knows who's filling anything out, and everyone should have a government issue photo ID. And boom, there you go. Trust in elections. And not only that, but it makes voting more of a real civic sort of event, as opposed to this sort of thing everyone does in their own little kind of cubbyhole, the comfort of their own home. I'm sure you've heard this a lot. What's your response to people who say that is the best way forward?
Yeah, I hear that. And I think it's all essentially about choice. Voting is personal. It is a community action. It is powerful action. And under Michigan law that voters passed themselves overwhelmingly in 2018 and again in 2022 is a system in which people have choices. You can vote on election day, and about a third of our residents do. The vast majority in the last few very high turnout elections have chosen instead to vote early in person or vote from home. And so my job is to make sure we're meeting everyone where they are and delivering them the opportunity to express their right, their voice at the ballot box, however they choose to use their options under the law. And so I think if there is a groundswell of support of changing that, then certainly the initiative process is there for that, just as it was for the groundswell of support in 18 and 22 to expand options to vote. Our job as election administrators is simply just to build out the system that makes it easier to vote and harder to cheat and enables every voice to be heard in convenient, safe, and secure ways, and comply with the law that the voters themselves have set.
It always seems weird to me, and maybe not weird to me, but that people who actually study elections, academics, political scientists, find that cheating in elections it happens, sure, but it is incredibly, incredibly rare. And yet the popular conception seems to be that left-wing folks are going around just filling out random ballots, and stuff's been, put in boxes everywhere. And it's just, there seems to be such a disconnect between what we believe we know from careful, rigorous study of this and what the general public often believes. And I'm wondering what your take is as to why there is such a gap between the actuality and the perception of this.
Well, we're certainly in an era of misinformation where there's a lot of different international even mechanisms in which people are trying to confuse or obfuscate the elections process and call into question its security. But on the other side of it is evidence that it is secure, and transparency of the election system helps with that. We've tried very much to lean into being transparent and open and allowing people to, serve as an election official. So you can see firsthand how secure our elections are. Everyone votes on paper ballots so that you can go back and reaffirm and re-examine the process itself. But the bottom line is I think we should make all decisions around evidence and data. And when there's evidence of wrongdoing, certainly we have to prosecute. We have to, see if we need to change the law in response. But all of the evidence over years and decades of looking at it has reinforced this idea that election fraud is very rare. And when it occurs, there are mechanisms in place to hold people accountable and also improve the law even more to increase efficiencies and security. So in many ways, the process is working. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that fraud is very rare. And I think I understand the confusion and the concern that particularly misinformation can really amplify and generate. But we all just need to circle back to evidence and transparency and have those be our guideposts for examining and defining the security of the system.
I wonder if among the cynics of us, and there are plenty of cynics in politics, certainly, that the general, I think, idea is that it's not that Republicans as a group care desperately and deeply about election security. It's just an electoral advantage sort of thing. And for a long time, the sort of conventional wisdom has been that lower turnout elections favor Republicans. But now it actually seems like, well, that might be changing a little bit, and low propensity voters might actually be more inclined to be Republican than Democrat voters. And so therefore, you got to wonder if this is happening. You look at the evidence, if Republicans are going to get off the election security bandwagon, if it actually ends up hurting them. Maybe I'm being too cynical here, but it seems to me I'm hearing some of that. I wanted to get your take on it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I just want everyone to vote, no matter who they vote for. And I want politicians to be responsive to the voters. So I think the more people who are voting in a system, in a democracy, regardless of the outcome of the election, the democracy is healthier and our election system are better as a result, because it's not just about the act of voting, but the accountability as well that voting both expresses and leads to. So I think, to me, our goal should always be ensuring people across the spectrum, everyone with the right to vote, is able to exercise it. And then I believe in the democratic process to kind of work itself out from there. But at the end of the day, if we have informed voters and engaged voters, regardless of the outcome of the election, it's going to be, I believe, a healthier system.
One of the things you mentioned in the book is the importance of finding what you call purpose in your rage. And I was hoping you could talk about that, especially maybe doing a comparative thing, how you see the left versus the right in terms of how good of a job they've done in finding purpose in rage.
Yeah, it's really a lesson that I gleaned after 9/11, which I talk about in the book, of where he felt sort of very enraged. And my husband chose in part to channel that anger into military service. And then in turn, seeing the challenge and the rage that can emerge by loss, particularly of so many people who, serve and protect us overseas in Afghanistan at the time and elsewhere, and oftentimes are forgotten when they come home, and finding rage over that and using that to channel energy into fighting for better treatment for military spouses and veterans. So it's really about this concept of, when something makes you angry, use that as fuel to make things better or to try to seek justice. And that can manifest itself in lots of different ways on both sides of the aisle. But it's about not just allowing rage to discourage you from participating or causing you to disengage, but really finding purpose of it and almost productivity out of it as a way towards sort of moving the needle on your particular purpose or your particular, issue that you want to fight for.
I feel like this is particularly a challenge for a lot of folks on the left at this point. You hear all these calls for Democrats to do something, and yet when you're in the minority basically everywhere, and you still have, I don't know, like 18 months or so before the midterm elections, the advice of, well, just wait around for the elections isn't very, inherently satisfying. So what do you tell folks on the Democratic side about, well, what am I supposed to do with myself except just be hyper pissed off at everything that's going on?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, that's exactly it. It's, I get it if you're feeling rage over anything right now. And certainly there's a lot of things to be upset about, from the economy and towards the treatment of people in this moment, and a lot of injustices that are emerging at the national and even international level. But at the end of the day, we also are all in states and we're all in local areas as well that are not just having elections, but have particularly important issues: employers, businesses, community organizations, people who are simply struggling to make ends meet, and to whom we can help by making their lives a little bit easier by volunteering at different settings and showing up for each other. So I think that one way to find purpose, if you're enraged around the current political situation, is not just to stay focused on the next election or supporting candidates in those elections that reflect your values, but also thinking about ways you can serve your community in your local town or your local home or in your state, because there's still a lot of things happening in states and cities and local governments every day, decisions being made every day that you can directly influence in a way that perhaps can make people's lives a little easier, lessen people's pain, improve economic standing and well-being, help build homes for people who are housing insecure, volunteer at a shelter where people who are seeking access to food are able to get it. There's lots of ways that we can channel the rage we're feeling right now into service and into supporting each other, and into, as I also talk about in my book, recognizing that there are a lot of other people out there who are hurting. And so asking yourself, how can I help them, instead of just focusing on your own rage, and using that service mindset to improve people's lives. And ultimately that can create the groundswell of support that can lead to successful elections and higher turnout and the like, and more informed and engaged voters in the next round.
I think that's very different from how maybe too many people deal with their rage, and it's just basically getting on social media and screaming at people, and it makes me feel worse.
That's one approach. I like being productive. I like doing things. I like helping people. And so one of the things I've learned, there were many times unrelated to politics where I was enraged about something as well in my workplace and elsewhere. And it was the people who helped me think about helping others, looking to see other people's pain and helping to lessen that as a way of getting through a moment of my own rage. That's really about trying to find purpose in it and being productive in moments like this, as opposed to just kind of, getting caught up in our own anger to the point where at the end of the day, whether we're posting online or doom scrolling, we just feel more angry on the other side of it. And wouldn't it be better to use that hour as a way to make someone else's life, particularly if someone is being threatened or dealing with, a challenge in related to the economy, to make their life a little bit easier? Start a new nonprofit, start a new business. There are ways we can all solve problems in our own backyard. And in moments like this, where it feels like there's a lot of problems at much higher levels, perhaps turning to our own social sphere and trying to solve problems immediately in front of us and make people's lives easier is one of the ways we can use our energy in this time to help stay mission focused and prepare for the next time there's an election, where you can then uplift and build a movement to organize and support candidates who reflect your values.
Do you think there's any value in working with our political opponents on matters of common interest? And I said, that might sound like a dumb question, which is a sad commentary, because you have both sides who say things like, well, we are the resistance. We are not going to help anyone from the other party on anything, because we're not going to give them a win that they can use to, win in the next election. So therefore, the most sensible thing for us to do is to resist everything as much as possible all the time and just drive them into the ground. What do you think about that?
Well, I think at the end of the day, we're all in this together. And so we have to find ways, even amidst a chaotic economy that is hurting a lot of people, in a moment where a lot of different communities are being used as political pawns. There's a time in which we're seeing limited access to healthcare on a number of things, and still things unfolding, and a lot of just change and uncertainty as a result of decisions made at the federal government over these last several weeks. There's an opportunity for us to still stay focused on who we are and defining who we are and fighting for who we are. And that means making sure we are, showing up at community meetings or hosting some of our own to talk about what we're experiencing and develop solutions together. It all gets back to whether or not we see our own power as individuals, or we're allowing other people to define and use their power against us. And I think in moments like this, we can find our own power and root our own light out of this moment through that power. And so connecting with each other, building that power is a really important thing to do in this moment, and doing it from a place of purpose, whether it's, addressing higher prices at grocery stores that we're seeing, or at the gas pump, and talking about that, talking about the fear many young kids are feeling in communities around this state and around this country who are, seeing gun violence unfold and worried about how that's going to affect them. Finding ways where we can support each other and stay connected to each other in these moments is how we build political power for the future. But it's also how we remember our own power to define our environment and who we are in this moment too.
You mentioned working with others, and in the book, you talk about the importance of what you call building your tribe. I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit here now.
Yeah, well, and also to sort of working with others. I think there's always an opportunity to work with others on issues that matter to us, and too often times we find ourselves on different sides of things, or in separate tribes when we do have more in common than perhaps we might see. So it's important to kind of look beyond those false choices sometimes and find common ground. And in addition to that, in finding our own mission, building a tribe around us that will enable us to serve in alliance with our purpose. That's usually like, what I talk about in the book is forming your own board of directors, your own group of people around you, some of whom may disagree with you, but who can help you stay honed to your interest and your purpose, even at a time when so many things might conspire to distract you from it. So surrounding yourself essentially with people who will help you be better, stronger, and more focused on what you want to accomplish is really critical in getting through anything, any fire, any challenge, any fight. And for me, importantly, I found that firsthand in 2020, when we're dealing with all of these individual challenges. The president is attacking me. There's a kidnapping attempt against the governor. At the same time, we can connect with each other as we did and build a tribe of support that enables us to be much more powerful than we would be as individuals.
Yeah. And one thing you mentioned in that, and I think is really important, is having at least someone in your group, in your board of directors, if you will, who can call you on your BS or challenge you, and who you respect enough to listen to when because I get the sense that one of all the failings that I see, at least in the second Trump administration, the biggest one perhaps is being in that bubble and nobody being willing to speak truth to power. But that's not just Donald Trump. I've seen this in a lot of leadership positions and leadership settings where they become more insular and get into that bubble. And of course, people on the right made an argument about Joe Biden and the Biden White House. And so what are your thoughts on that, and how leaders can try to, not get caught in that bubble?
Yeah, and it gets back to kind of what we were talking about earlier about fear versus courage, and being bold versus safe, and surrounding yourself with people who will help you see both perspectives as you make your best decision on how to proceed. It can be really dangerous, no matter what side of the aisle we're on, to be in a bubble where you're only hearing voices that are saying yes, or where you're only hearing sort of voices of caution, where you're only hearing voices of boldness. You need to have a diverse set of voices around you, people who understand your mission and are committed to it, but see all the different perspectives and ways in which you can get there, and also who are willing to challenge your own presumptions and assumptions about your path. So it's about even, one of the things that I talk about is even having people in that circle who were former rivals, who are uniquely positioned to kind of look at the cracks in your argument and pull them out so that you can see some of your flaws and vulnerabilities. All of that only helps you become a stronger warrior for your purpose. And so whether you're a political leader, a business leader, a community leader, or even a parent, being able to surround yourself with people who will both affirm your mission, but also be willing to help you see when you might need a little bit more direction or pushback, as it's called, that can be really valuable and critical even for enabling you to be your best self when you step out into that arena.
At one point in the book, you write that, if you help people first, if you make that your goal, the money, the accolades will follow. And I was thinking about this, and just last night, in fact, my wife and I were watching one of our favorite shows, Abbott Elementary. And for those folks who don't know, it's this group of elementary school teachers in Philadelphia, and they have almost no resources. They do a ton of work. They invest so much of themselves, and they do important, good work, as do real life teachers and civil servants all over the country. But there's not a whole lot in the way of money and accolades. And so I wonder if that's, I feel like if you really want to help people first, if you're expecting that stuff to happen after that, you might end up being pretty bitterly disappointed.
Well, my parents were special education teachers. So for me, my foundation is really rooted out of, going to school with them when I was a very young age and watching them fight for their kids to have access to, basic opportunities to succeed in their schools and their public schools as everyone else. And to me, there's a lot of value and purpose in that. And of course, there's also not a lot of money in that field. And I became an educator myself and saw the same thing, but also counseled with and worked to school with a lot of folks who went right out of law school into those high paying jobs. I think choice is important. People can choose the path that's best for them based on their needs and set of circumstances. But I always found that if the root of what's motivating you is money or accolades, that it can oftentimes lead to you to abandon your purpose and abandon the sort of the substantive work you want to do in exchange for chasing those other things. And so I argue for flipping that model. Certainly it's completely understandable for people to want to be wealthy and appreciate the praise and recognition that comes from doing good work. But it starts with the work. It starts with work that is mission driven and focused on moving the needle on something. And I argue that the something that we could in many ways look at or approach from a moving the needle standpoint is helping people, improving other people's lives. And if you look at over time, the most quote unquote successful people or the people who had the highest job satisfaction or life satisfaction, there's an element that's driving them that's rooted in service and helping others, whether it's their family, whether it's their kids, whether it's their parents, whether it's their community, whether it's their workplace, whether it's more people writ large. But if you're helping people first, if you're motivated by a mission that is measured by the impact your work is having on other people's lives, then oftentimes, and every story I tell references this, you'll see money and accolades follow, but it can follow out of that rooting and purpose in work and in work that helps improve or make others' lives easier.
I'd like to close on an optimistic note whenever I can. And honestly, the first few months of the Trump administration, I've not felt very optimistic much of the time. In fact, I found myself shutting down at times. But let's see if we can draw some optimism out of this. I mean, when you look around at everything that's happening, I guess I'm wondering what that you see maybe gives you some cause for hope, for optimism in the near-term future.
Yeah. I appreciate the goal of ending on an optimistic note, because I try to live that optimistic, hopeful path too. And it is hard in times like this when our economy is in chaos and, factory workers, auto workers, people everywhere in between are paying higher prices at grocery stores, at the gas pump, and at a time when we should all be working together to make life easier, it feels like it's getting harder. Our rights and freedoms are under attack. We've seen funding for students with disabilities, rural students, medical support, all of it being cut in just like the last few months. And so, yes, there's a lot of reasons to feel hopeless and sad and discouraged in this moment. But to me, the power of the people will always be more powerful than the people in power. And we can't forget that. One of the things I talk about in my book is how to make lemonade, for lack of better words, out of moments like this. And it starts with acknowledging the pain and letting that sit, right? And so we can't turn our eyes away from that. But the second step is to step back and say, what am I going to do about it? What can I do about it? What's realistic for me to be able to do about it? How can I, in my own sphere, do something to address the bleeding that I'm seeing? It could be large, it could be small, it could be simply just taking care of my kid in this moment, right? And making sure that they have what they need to 10 years from now lead our way out of this moment, or 5 years from now, or the like. So think about the action. And then the sort of third part is execute and, take action. Whether it's, stepping up to fight back against the threats raining down on communities all across the country from Washington, whether it's, trying to address healthcare by developing unique ways for people to get access to it. Take action is the key. Meaningful action that is geared towards hopefully making someone else's life a little bit easier. That helps us, again, find purpose in that dark moment that we're in, but we find that purpose through connecting with our own power that we always have to define ourselves and what we're going to do in this moment. And no amount of threats or chaos or confusion emerging out of the federal level takes away our power to actually do good in our own sphere of influence. And we all have them. So find out creative, bold ways that you can choose courage over fear, that you can choose to engage over disengaging, and know that when we do that, history tells us that every time courageous people step up for the right ideals and the right things, we win, we succeed. Sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes it's a bumpy road in between now and then, but we will get to the other side of this. And if we hone our strength and our power as purposeful warriors through that path, we can emerge on the other side of this moment with a stronger, healthier democracy and economy and community than ever before. And that's the world I'm fighting for.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Jocelyn Benson, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,